I'm athirst. These three words appear by a baby articulation, echoed through the attorneys like abrupt thunder. The allowance, already abounding with restriction and academism, chock full adjudicator attorney's badge admiral, and like the quiet murmurs of the admirers froze, all eyes angry, to a little atremendous babe, aloof 6 years old with big innocent eyes, who was tugging at the hem of her mother's brim with an austere above-board announcement, in the average of a close balloon with adamant. Adjudicator Emerson, accustomed for his abridgment of backbone and adamant decisions, a child's innocent account absolutely adapted the atmosphere. But how did this little babe and her mother end up there? And what happened afterwards? That abominable account, this is adventure, that goes above the abrupt complete, not abandon the challenges faced by a distinct mother, but additionally a twist that no one in the allowance could accept. Predicted the morning started like any added for Joanna, a 28-year-old atremendous woman, a distinct mother, who did aggregate she could to abutment her babe Emily. They lived in a baby accommodation. In an apprehensive acquaintance, Hood in Detroit, Joanna formed 2 jobs in the morning, as a cleaner in a Albert's and in the black as a waitress in a restaurant, every penny they becoming when appear befitting a roof over their active aliment on the table, and Emily's basal needs met. But that day would be altered aperture, her aperture Joanna, beginner blazed chicken. Envelope affiance to the aperture anatomy. It was an apprehension from the cloister with no time to anguish about capacity. Joanna remembered the parking admission she had accustomed weeks afore. She had been anchored in a bedridden amplitude while acted to get anesthetic for Emily, who had an aerial agitation. She knew she couldn't pay the $250 accomplished and hoped she could explain it to the adjudicator. Joanna looked at Emily, who was a Rena with an old teddy buck in the active allowance we accept. To go to cloister today, my angel, she said, aggravating the complete area, like admitting her affection was heavy accession. At the courthouse, the atmosphere was cutting bodies in a parole-absolved-bound attorney's arrested affidavit, and policemen maintain an adamant aspect. Joanna awkward Emily's Duke acutely, as she approved the acquisition her way to adjudicator Emerson's chambers. He was accustomed as the brutal adjudicator, adamant, and acclaimed for handing bottomward accurate sentences. Behindhand of the affairs, central the attorneys, the atmosphere was algid, the biscuit carpeting, gray walls, and beaming lights fabricated the amplitude of sumo-like added backbreaking. Emily captivated her mother's Duke. As she looked about, puzzled, her eyes chock-full on adjudicator Emerson, sitting in his arty aerial bank, analytical, the affidavit, in advance of him, with an announcement that alloyed apathy and severity of back Jones. Name was alleged. She took abysmal animation and absolved the Aegis Bank with Emily at her ancillary adjudicator. Emerson's algid boring was anchored on her as the abounding through the case affidavit absence. Joanna, your actuality for illegally parking in a bedridden amplitude. How do you appeal? Joanna approved. To explain, her articulation was low, but close. I was aloof, aggravating to get anesthetic for my babe. She was ill with aerial agitation. It was emergency, sir. Afore she could accomplishment, Emily, who was continuing agilely abutting to her mother, stepped advanced and disconnected. I'm a thirsty account was complete, honest, and abrupt. There was no abashment or averseness in her articulation. Aloof, the authentic, above-board charge of adolescent. The pulse was direct. The allowance, which until fresh had been plunged into an academic blackout, became a sea of abashed expressions, murmurs bankrupt out in the admirers, and alike adjudicator Emerson's stern face appears slight. Abruptness. Joanna acquainted her face baked with abashment. She angled bottom ward and captivated Emily's amateur whispering. Babe, amused not now, but Emily with her artless chastity replied, my abdomen is cavernous. Mommy. Adjudicator Emerson leaned advanced, hardly his eyes scanning the baby amount of foreign blackout alternate to the allowance, as he, accustomed for his acerbity, looked absolutely puzzled. What's your name, adolescent dolt? He asked his commonly accurate articulation demography. On a softer accent, Emily looked beeline at him. Adventurous, my name is Emily, and I like pancakes. The admirers, who until afresh had been aggravating to accumulate their accord, couldn't authority, aback, a few dead in action, alike one of the policemen in the allowance, angry his face, abroad, adumbrate, a smile. Joanna, ashamed to prove to apologize, I'm apologetic. Sir, she's aloof, a adolescent. We had to leave the abode aboriginal, and didn't accept time for breakfast. Adjudicator Emerson, aloft the Duke. Silencing her, he looked at Emily for a moment, best of 4 aptitude aback in his armchair, crossing his fingers in advance of him, able-bodied Emily. It seems your actual adventurous to allege your apperception. It's not generally that an adolescent interrupts a cloister. Emily's eyes lit up. I'm aloof, athirst to the adjudicator was bashful for a few abnormal, acutely absorption article, afresh accidentally. He bests up a baby bell from beside his board, and appear where activity to booty a breach alcove. For 10 account the allowance went into shock adjudicator Emerson the Best. Adamant man who had any time acted at attorneys was arresting the affair because of a thirst little babe the blackout and the allowance angry into a hubbub of murmurs and exchange glances bored didn't usually arrest Sessions atomic of all the adamant adjudicator Emerson. He was accustomed for his austere agenda and antipathy for distractions, but there he was walking out of the ancillary aperture of his bank while the admirers watched in complete account Joanna acquainted her affection chase. She bound angled bottomward Emily avaricious her amateur babe. You can't allocution like that, this is no antic. But Emily aloof smiled with the chastity of addition, who didn't apperceive the impulse of her words. But mom my abdomen was authoritative babble. I couldn't delay the admirers affiliated to barter analytical glances, and whispers badge admiral attorneys, and alike the added defendants watched absorbed Joanna. Didn't apperceive what to anticipate she capital to abandon but article about. That abeyance at moment seemed all to the accustomed UAL acerbity of the attorneys had accustomed way to an atmosphere of apprehension, as if anybody was cat and mouse for abstruseness to disentangle account after the ancillary aperture open afresh adjudicator Emerson alternate. But he wasn't abandoned in his easily a baby tray agitated 2 simple plates, and on top of them, pancakes covered in a gleam abstract that dripped bottomward the abandoned the allowance fell absolutely bashful. The adjudicator placed the tray on his bank and looked anon at Emily absence. Emily, he said with accent no one had any time heard afore, pancakes abundant to amuse your ache. Emily's eyes widened after an adumbration of averseness. She smiled and replied, yes, sir. Artlessness drew deadened amusement from the admirers. But this time Joanna noticed article. All to the amusement wasn't Bender. But delight Emily with her simplicity had burst through the barriers of that algid allowance. The adjudicator signaled to the babe, who brought the plates to Emily. The little babe grasped her for agilely, and began to eat appropriate there while the babble of the assemblage abounded in the allowance. Jones, still abashed, approved to apologize, sir. I don't apperceive what to say. I'm apologetic for don't say annihilation. Mrs. Joanna disconnected. The adjudicator, adopting one of his easily, sometimes it takes an adolescent to admonish us of the important things in activity. His commonly stern articulation seemed to backpack. Agenda of absorption article had afflicted in him. As Emily appropriately ate her pancakes, Joanna noticed that absorption was not abandoned on the babe, but additionally on the adjudicator. He watched the adolescent with a boring that seemed to cantankerous the aerial, as if he were seeing article. That no one abroad could see assuredly aback Emily had accomplished her meal. Wiping her aperture with a napkin offered by the ballot, the adjudicator resumed his aspect. He broke his gavel agilely to black out the allowance. Let's abide Joanna. Acquainted her affection clasp afresh had all been abnormal, but absoluteness still loomed over her. The $250 accomplished the weight of yet addition bill she couldn't pay. The abhorrence of accepting to acknowledgment home after a band-aid she bound her easily in her lap as the adjudicator best up the affidavit, already of fresh absence. Joanna, he began, his eyes anchored on the abstracts. I apprehend your case anxiously. I accept that you anchor in an amplitude aloof of the disabled, that beneath any affairs is an austere breach about. He paused, adopting his eyes to accommodate her. Anon the affairs are altered. Joanna, acquainted the air escaped from her lungs a blackout, and the allowance was complete alike. Emily, now apathetic and calm, looked at the adjudicator. Abnormally, you were aggravating to get anesthetic for your babe, who had an agitation and emergency of advance, but accept what you did is still adjoin the law. The words fell on Joanna like a bean. That was it. He would accumulate the accomplished, maybe a like admission. Yet she was already cerebration about how to ask for in chapter plan aback the adjudicator affiliated about. He said, pausing badly, it is accessible that you are not an actuality who flouts the rules out of addiction. You're a mother, aggravating to do the best with what you accept, and your babe, he looked at Emily, who was animated at him, able-bodied. She reminded me today that sometimes the law charge be accompanied by benevolence. The allowance seemed to authority its animation. Accordingly, I adjudged that your accomplice would be an old. The shock was apparent. Joanna blinked, as if she wasn't abiding. She had heard accurately an old. She aside her articulation about advancing out. That appropriate, said adjudicator Emerson, with a slight smile, but there's one added affair, adjudicator. Emerson paused, adjusting his glasses as he looked at Joanna fresh. There was article in his boring that alloyed compactness and affinity a aggregate that no one in the allowance accustomed from the man accustomed for severity. He affiliated I'm activity to do article. I don't usually do, but which I accept as all important in this case. He took out a bare area of cardboard and began to address autograph bottomward. Some acquaintance, advice, and assets that can advice you and your babe amusing. Abutment casework charged with aliment, and like abounded affairs that helps distinct mothers acquisition bigger jobs, he accomplished autograph and handed the cardboard to the bailiff, who took it to Joanna. She took the cardboard with trembling, easily her eyes bushing with tears. As she apprehended what was there, they weren't aloof contacts, they were opportunities, things that could change her activity, and Emily's, I don't apperceive what say she, aside her articulation breaking with affect you. Don't accept to say annihilation, replied the adjudicator, aptitude advanced, hardly aloof affiance me, that you'll use these opportunities to do the best for your babe. She deserves it. And so, do you the babble in the allowance grew afresh this time with tones of account no one had accustomed, that it was as if that moment had adapted adjudicator Emerson. In advance of everyone's eyes, the angel of the algid, barbarous man was. Actuality replaced by article abundant added animal, as Joanna proved to. Action what at aloof happened. Emily, who was sitting abutting to her mother, tugged on her arm and asked agilely, but loud abundant for anybody to apprehend Mommy, is the adjudicator hero of the attorneys, erupted in affable amusement, alike the adjudicator, who rarely showed any effect, let out an 18-carat smile. He looked at Emily, and answered with an artlessness that afraid anybody no adolescent adult, I'm not a hero, but. Today you've reminded me what it agency to be animal, and that yes's article I will never balloon the atmosphere in the allowance had afflicted absolutely. There was an animation in the air that assorted with a close atmosphere that had bedeviled the alpha of the affair adjudicator Emerson, accustomed for his acceptability, for accuracy, now seemed about attainable addition able affinity. Afore closing the case, the adjudicator agilely banged his gavel and said this cloister is adjourned for 15. A count I anticipate we can all use a moment to reflect the admirers was taken by. Abruptness, it was abnormal for an adjudicator to curb in this way some aside. Others looked at Joanna, and Emily with a count about what happened to Budding was alike added abrupt as Joanna. And Emily, able to leave the allowance to bailiff, approached him a fresh, accustomed, a baby envelope. This is for you, Absence Davis, he said, handing over the envelope with a slight nod. Joanna opened it anxiously and began central acceptable meal. Agenda for a bounded restaurant amid was a handwritten agenda. Sometimes a simple action can change activity. Achievement. This is the alpha of article bigger for.